Okay, come on back.
Y'all come.
As John says, y'all come.
Right.
So we're going to be talking now about performance anxiety, and as I said, unfortunately, Julie Jaffe Nagel, who's from the University of Michigan and has a practice in Michigan, is home ill. So instead of Julie, you're going to have Eric Maisel pretending to be Julie with Julie's PowerPoint. And, you know, I was trying to kind of, just for the fun of it, urge Eric to sort of dress up as Julie. But then, you know, I thought, this isn't, you know, he and I are from the Northern California Bay Area, and, you know, we can get away with stuff like that in San Francisco, but I don't know about Dallas, you know. So he's just going to be Eric. Okay.
Good old Eric.
All right.
Well, I wore as close to pink as I could. Oh, PowerPoint. Okay. Performance anxiety. That was easy. You'll sort of get two presentations for the price of one. Julie is psychodynamically and/or psychoanalytically oriented, and I'm not particularly. I'm more cognitive, behavioral, existential. So I may be disputing her presentation, which will be interesting. And
But in all fairness to Julie, I think Julie actually was trained both in CBT and analytic thinking, so it may be a little more
darn, I
eclectic.
wanted to make that a better fight. So
Yeah,
don't-
too
don't
bad,
say that.
Eric.
Double
I
chair.
feel I have to take care of Julie in her absence.
Okay.
Double chair.
So, performance anxiety represents a complex constellation of psychological and physical issues. Yes, of course, but that probably also conflates mild, moderate, and severe performance anxiety all in one. Because if we think of mild performance anxiety, that's pretty much a ubiquitous problem. We know that the number one phobia, that when people report phobias, is the fear of public speaking. So we know that it generalizes across all populations, mild performance anxiety. If you have your panel later today or tomorrow, there's probably a little piece of you that has that little, if not performance anxiety piece, still the cognitive piece of wondering if you really have left your notes back home and those kinds of things. So although it represents a complex constellation of issues, it's also a very straightforward human response to danger. And that's what anxiety is essentially. It's a response, it's a warning signal that the body generates that something scary is about to happen. What's the scary thing here? Well, loss of self-esteem, maybe career malfunction if you perform poorly at a certain moment. This is not irrational. Sometimes anxiety is called irrational fear, but it's not irrational to be worried about your performance. So I think it's unfair to call performance anxiety irrational fear. I think there are real rational reasons for being worried about how well or poorly you perform, including how people look at you, self-esteem, self-image issues. Probably if I take that much time on each slide, Susan is going to... This is akin to the eustress-distress debate. Some performance anxiety can be helpful. I wish Julie were here to argue that because I'm not quite sure I agree with that, but I'm going to let that go. Here are some of the physical symptoms of performance anxiety. I'll let that just sit up there. I'm not going to try to run through them. I'm sure you know them very well. And when we deliver materials to music students, of course, we want them to understand what the physical symptoms of performance anxiety are. Julie is calling these emotional symptoms of performance anxiety. Of course, another way to say it is that this is what's going on in the person who's experiencing performance anxiety. The emotional-cognitive part is probably much more poorly understood by your music students. They understand that they need to go to the bathroom or that they're having butterflies in there are things that they understand because there are clear physical manifestations of that performance anxiety. What will be much less clear to them is if 2 months before an important audition, they are saying, I'm feeling awfully tired. They won't quite get that that's a manifestation of performance anxiety. And performance anxiety being primarily anticipatory anxiety. Worst when you're in the green room, right? Worst right before performance is when it's worst. But there's a long period before performance when people can experience performance anxiety. And that connects to, I'm going to sort of ramble, but I want to get some ideas across. What's the way we deal with anxiety primarily? We try to avoid the situations that provoke it. If we're afraid of flying, we don't fly. If we're afraid of performing, it's not that we don't perform, but we procrastinate with respect to rehearsing. So we find other things to do rather than rehearse. And even if your students are rehearsing round the clock, there probably are still ways in which their performance anxiety, which, as I say, in a mild level is ubiquitous, is manifesting itself even though the performance is not imminent. It's important to remember that it's like a background coloration of your student's entire life, because there's always a performance somewhere down the pike that they're thinking about. I guess all I want to add to this looking at symptoms would be, she has, is cognitive up there? I guess not. I would add to her list of symptoms, specifically cognitive symptoms, and that is the way that music students are talking to themselves and holding their performances. How important these performances are to them, and how to normalize and lower the threshold of sort of noise about the importance of performance. I guess what Julie is wanting to say here is that it's logical that mild performance anxiety is going to increase to maybe moderate, even severe levels when there are very important performances coming up. It's important to distinguish between, let's say, everyday performance, even in class, where there is anxiety, and then super anxiety. So you want, if we are disseminating information to students, we want it to be, so to speak, at the two levels. One is everyday performance anxiety and how to handle that, and then more severe performance anxiety, which probably, Julie would argue, is the kind of performance anxiety where long-term or psychodynamic therapy might help more than cognitive behavioral therapy, perhaps. Musicians are unique. Well, yes and no. I'm going to argue the other side. Musicians are unique, but all of us experience performance anxiety. And we experience performance anxiety most when the performance matters. I think that's really important, because you may not experience any performance anxiety when you're performing in an arena that doesn't actually matter to you. There was an interesting social psych experiment done in two groups. One were scientists and one were humanist types. And in their own classrooms, the scientists experienced no anxiety because they were providing factual material. The humanists had actually quite a bit of anxiety because sort of they had to reinvent the wheel every time they presented a lecture, because they were rethinking things and what have you. So it looked like humanists were more anxious than scientists. But if you gave them each the same issue to talk about, some important issue in their life, something that made them go to a place where they were not accustomed to go, both populations experienced the same, quite interestingly severe performance anxiety. So sometimes our lack of performance anxiety is simply masked by perhaps our role or the material or what have you. But as soon as the performance matters, we can pretty much guarantee that performance anxiety is going to be part of the equation. So I guess I'm just countering the musicians are unique with the, am I already over? Okay, with the, we all experience it. I guess I will let this just stand. Oh, no, I can't let this just stand, my word. Self-help doesn't help. No, I don't think that's true. I think if you do not buy into self-help, self-help doesn't work. But that's also true of therapy or counseling. If you're physically present but not there, that doesn't work either. So I think self-help, in fact, does work, and we're talking about self-care, self-management ideas throughout the conference. And we want to promulgate the idea that self-help, in fact, does help, I think. We want clear resources, and we want student buy-in in order for that to work. But given clear resources, and given that we are helping students buy into the notion that they have responsibility for self-care and good reasons for self-care, then I would say that self-help with respect to performance anxiety absolutely does work. This comes from the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic world, and I'm not touching it.
I would, but Eric's doing this presentation.
Oh, but I can't. But the universe is making me stay there. Oh, okay. This again is in the psychodynamic world. Of course, these are important issues, but I'm racing through to get someplace else.
We'll treat you later.
Anybody have a clue how it can move to the next one? No?
Throw it.
Maybe it is the last one. Oh, it's just slow. Okay. This is where we want to stay, I think, for our last few minutes, and that is strategies for help. One size does not fit all. Again, this is Julie expressing that there'll be different experiences of performance anxiety, different causes of performance anxiety for different individuals. And again, all of that is true. But I think that in one sense, one size does fit all, in the sense that by providing some basic information, I think now it's moving of its own accord, I'm letting go of it. By providing some basic information about what the experience of performance anxiety looks like and feels like and seems like in the brain, by providing that basic information, and then by providing a simple little list of X number of things that a person can do to reduce the experience of performance anxiety, both long-term, that is, in the 3 months before a major performance, or so to speak, all the time, since there's always a performance on the horizon, all the time, in the moment, which would probably be something like a breathing exercise or a breathing cognitive exercise put together, and then right before performance. And that's why I think you really want to help all of your students have a going-on ritual, a way of dealing with that hour or 15 minutes or 1 minute before performance that they have really thought through and that maybe you have helped them think through. And if that includes a guided visualization or a mantra or an affirmation, whatever it is, that will be tailored to the individual. That'll be the student deciding for herself what she wants that to be. But to begin talking about, do you have your going on ritual in place? Do you have a ritual in place? Do you know what to do over time to deal with performance anxiety? And do you know what to do in every given moment to reduce your experience of anxiety? Those three things, we can certainly help our students think about those three things and do better in those arenas. So that was Julie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for the improv. And also, you know, it was interesting because when we were first trying to decide who was going to do what area, I have to say, which I wrote in the workshop work group kind of process piece in the written material, that any one of the people on this panel could have written any one of these areas, because I think everyone has been very
We're brilliant.
talented. No, but you know, working clinically over time, that these are all areas that we work with. But so Eric was actually originally going to do the performance anxiety piece before Julie joined us, and so here you are. Little did you know you're going to do both. Okay, so next I'd like to introduce Dr. Ken White, who's a psychiatrist coming to us from New Orleans. Let me find my thing here. And Ken is an assistant clinical professor at Louisiana State University and Tulane University Medical Centers, or medical schools, as well as the director of emergency psychiatry at the Medical Center of Louisiana, or Charity Hospital, as well as the psychiatric consultant to the New Orleans Musicians Clinic in New Orleans, which is how I knew Ken. Anyway, really delighted he was able to join us today, and he'll be talking to us about depression in college music students and musicians.
Will she do my talk? No. Well, thank you for inviting us. I'm amused that there's so much talk about performance anxiety, and here all of us are dealing with performance anxiety in our own ways, and it's an interesting experience. I like the idea of thinking of the audience as pumpkins. I've always preferred the notion of thinking of the audience as being naked. But I think the idea was that it somehow separates you from the audience when you do that sort of thing, and the idea is to interact, so I won't do that today. I'm here to talk about depression and musicians. I've been working in the New Orleans Musicians Clinic for some years now, and it's just been a fascinating experience. And it's become clear that musicians face very unique problems and problems that many of us don't have to face. And I think that it's important for musicians to learn about those problems, to be prepared for it, and learn ways to cope with it. One of the things that I'm particularly aware of and work with in the New Orleans Clinic is that we have a very, very large number of musicians, most of whom are uninsured and underserved in terms of their medical needs, and both their physical medical needs and their mental medical needs are extremely important, and it's very hard for them to have access to medical care. And this clinic was developed as a private nonprofit organization with the help of the medical schools in New Orleans, and it's just been tremendously successful and tremendously helpful. And I know that there are other people here who are associated with musicians' clinics, and I think that the more that these kinds of things can be developed, the better off we'll all be. Certainly, it's hard enough to do this work. It's a very trying profession to be in, to be a musician or to be an artist, and certainly history is replete with numerous examples of those people who have toiled in obscurity and practiced their arts without any recognition or without any positive feedback, haven't been able to make much of a living, but who in the end, either when they're alive, often after they're dead, have a huge impact on all of us. And I think that it's critical that we support the arts and allow the sort of things that musicians and other artists do, allow that to be part of our lives. I think that in a general sense, art and creativity are a very real reflection of social and cultural health that I think music and painting and theater, all of the arts, allow us all, and especially those of us who don't have those kinds of talents, to more fully imagine the world and more fully imagine ourselves, and it's critically important. Again, I think it's essential that we provide the support that's necessary to allow people to continue to do this kind of work. I think you as educators also, and I know that many of you are performers as well, have the important task of teaching and nurturing and guiding these students through this process. And what I want to do is talk about the specific mental health issue of depression, which is very, very prevalent. Before I came down here, I was talking with a friend who's a psychologist who's with the LSU School of Medicine, and he's a singer and has his own band and knows an awful lot about what it's like trying to do this work. And we were talking about the stresses and the risks and all of that. And finally he said, you know, you really have to be a little crazy to do this work. And I'm not sure that I agree with that, but I'm certainly glad that there are those who are willing to risk a little craziness in order to bring the music that sustains us. What we want to do is to try to help people continue to do that. Well, and again, this is just a brief overview of the paper that's in your notebook, and all of us are trying to give you as much information as possible, but it's going to be important to, if you want more information, to read through the papers that we've written. What I tried to do in my paper, and it was really written expressly for the students, although it came out of a little piece that I'd done for the New Orleans Musician Clinic newsletter, so that it also is oriented toward those musicians who are out performing. And someone mentioned that we were talking at the break, and oftentimes students aren't prepared for what the real world is all about, that we teach them a craft, but don't teach them what a lifestyle might be like. And that's, it's very important for us to do that. I tried to write a paper that would, as clearly and as succinctly as possible, describe what depression is, to try to inform them what depression is about. And I think that the more familiar we are with anything, the less mystery there is about it. And certainly demystifying mental health is a critical thing for us to do. Some of it, of the mystification of mental health, is our own doing. But certainly there's a good deal of anxiety and concern about mental health issues that are hard for us to acknowledge and face and end up trying to do something about. But the more we know about it, the less threatening it will be, and certainly understanding that it is that it is something that's very prevalent. I mean, again, with anxiety, with performance anxiety, Steve mentioned that's one of the primary phobias that people have, and the article that I'd read some years ago was saying that it's only second to death in terms of what people fear most, and certainly the music students are going to have to deal with this very ubiquitous problem. In terms of depression, most of us have certainly had some experience with depressed feelings and know something about that. I think that few of us are really ready to experience the profound changes in our emotional states that clinical depression can make. It can be an overwhelming and extremely problematic experience. Although many of us will or have experienced it, it's a very prevalent problem. 15% of us in our lifetimes will experience it. I think Susan noted that maybe up to 25% of women, it's more prevalent in women than in men. And there's certainly some suggestion that among musicians and other artists that there is a higher prevalence of depression. And I think some of that has to do with simply the lifestyle that is involved and some of the problems that musicians have to face that the rest of us don't have to face. In the paper, I discussed the symptoms of depression to try to sort of familiarize the students with what it's about. And again, we all know something about it. There's a point at which our normal experience of depression becomes pathological, and that really has to do with both an inner sense of changing in a way that we're simply not ourselves, and it has to do with a change in behavior and an inability to carry on with our lives in a normal way. The symptoms themselves tend to be related to changes in mood, to physiological changes, to changes in our activity levels, changes in energy levels, changes in the way we think, and changes in self-esteem. I think we're going to talk about them in more detail somewhat later, but just briefly, the changes in mood obviously have to do with feeling depressed, sad, hopeless, helpless. There's a point at which you become so depressed that the world changes its character for you, and there's a sense of simply not being able to relate to the world and to yourself in the way that has felt normal for you throughout your life. Physiological changes include changes with sleep, either increased or decreased sleep. Some people take to bed and stay there for a long time. Others can't sleep and become more agitated. There are also changes in appetite and sex drive, and then just a loss of interest in or the pleasure in living, and a withdrawal from one's usual way of participating in the world. There can be agitation and restlessness, as I mentioned, or a decreased level of activity and a withdrawal. And sometimes there's a profound psychomotor retardation where people really completely withdraw from the world and have a hard time taking care of themselves and a hard time going through the daily activities of living that we all must do. People often feel a decrease in energy, both physical and mental, feel fatigued, and have difficulty accomplishing any physical and mental task. Effects on thinking can have to do with the inability to think clearly, having trouble concentrating, difficulty making decisions, having memory problems, and being distractible. And then finally, the effect of, or the symptoms on self-esteem have to do with a sense of feeling worthless, having self-loathing, or at times feeling suicidal and wishing to be dead. And this is something that where it becomes extremely serious and something needs to be done. As educators, I think that it can be difficult to see many of these manifestations. I mean, as a psychiatrist, it's always interesting to me. Sometimes people come and of course they're crying and clearly look depressed and distressed, and it's not hard to identify something of what they might be feeling. But oftentimes people come and we talk for a while, and it only comes out that they're feeling depressed later, and even the extent when it's a severe depression might not be obviously apparent, and it can take some while for that to be clear. I think in the college student population, adolescents and young adults may respond somewhat differently, and it may be difficult to pick up when someone is depressed. Certainly there may be behavioral changes in terms of performance and decrease in performance or class attendance or whatnot that suggest that something is wrong with the student. And there's probably not a lot that you can do proactively to intervene, but it's important to be available should someone come to you and start talking about you, about themselves to you, so that you can try to help them get the help that they need. One of the interesting parts of the paper was the special risks that musicians face, and there are other. I think there are other professions that have similar risks, but none, I think, that have them that are quite so consistent and include most of them. I've described these risks as the depressive Ds. This is kind of one of those corny conceits that I'm sure that the music students will roll their eyes about, but I'd hope that it might make them remember them more. But that has to do with disruption of biological rhythms like sleep and whatnot that we had talked about before. Drugs, all drugs can play a role in depression. Drugs are ubiquitous in many music scenes and can create significant problems. Diets when you're on the road, or even having an irregular performance or practice schedule, it's hard to eat well and take care of yourself. Debt, divorce, day job, and didn't get the job are all the sort of social problems that musicians face because of the nature of the work that they do. What you can do, I think, as educators, again, is share your own experience, be available to them, and encourage them to um, to live in a way that prevents these sorts of things. And in the paper, too, I've made some recommendations that should help minimize these risks. Most of these are sort of a commonsensical approach to living well and avoiding the pitfalls that musicians have. And again, you can be encouraging. It's important. You have a very difficult job of educating them and being available to them without being a parent. I'm sure all of you who've raised children know that the more parental you are, the more likely you are to have the opposite response. But it's important to be able to be available and to encourage them to do the things that you feel will be useful for them. And finally, I've included some comments about treatment and what can be done. The fact is that depression is very treatable. Most depressions will clear up no matter what, but treatment will make it happen much more quickly. And treatment can be psychological with psychotherapy and some sort of psychotherapeutic intervention, or it can also be medical. There are numerous medications that work well and quickly. And in the most severe cases of depression, even ECT is an alternative. It's our last choice, but it can be life-saving if someone is severely depressed. So I'll be glad to answer questions in our question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, now I'm going to talk about substance use and abuse in college music students. So let's get the PowerPoint going back again. Maestro, Bob? Okay. So, first question, plain devil's advocate, is why worry about substance use? Here's a report by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation concluding that drug, alcohol, and tobacco abuse is the cause of more deaths, illnesses, and disabilities than any other preventable health condition and seriously undermines America's family life, economy, and public safety. Many of the problems, aside from this, many of the problems related to alcohol and drug use, such as motor vehicle accidents and violent crimes, occur in the absence of full-blown addictive disorders and often negatively impact their non-drinking victims as much as their using counterparts. So that's really important to recognize that we're not just talking about alcohol and drug dependency here, but just high-risk use as well, which is a lot of what I'll be talking about. Okay, so what we know is that young adults in general tend to use substances more than any other age group. Many of young people abuse substances and then go on to not develop addictions, but there are a lot of problems that can happen in the meantime. And the result of this is that the U.S. Surgeon General has identified college high-risk or binge drinking as a major public health problem, and the estimates look like about 40% of college students binge drink nationally. One thing that I found, I was very lucky in doing this paper in that it was kind of a short circuit of looking much more scholarly than I otherwise probably would have had time to do. But there was a major task force on college drinking sponsored by the National Institutes of Alcoholism and Abuse, NIAAA. And so this is a lot of pretty up-to-date material that just came out in 2002 that I was able to use for this paper. What we know is that there's a wide range across the country of these rates. I think John Hipple had done a study of college music students, I'm assuming at UNT, that showed they were only binge drinking about 29% of them, which was low compared to this national average. But again, we're talking in kind of broad strokes here, knowing that, you know, different colleges may have different individual rates. Okay, so looking at the prevalence rates for professional musicians, we really have not established this in a formal way. Most of it comes from self-report. But from those self-reports, it's pretty obvious that there is some ongoing consistency about musicians reporting substance abuse problems. Okay. As is often emphasized, for better or worse in the media, the association between substance abuse and musicians runs pretty deep in our culture. And as I said, even though we're not sure what the prevalence rates are, even from the ICSOM study, you know, 10% of people, of professional classical musicians said they thought alcohol was a problem, which is pretty much the national kind of working statistic for men for alcohol dependence. Mark Schuckett at UC San Diego says 10% for men in the country and 5% for women is pretty typical. So what I've always said is that if professional musicians are only as alcohol dependent or drug dependent as regular people, it's still a major problem. Okay, so saying, okay, let's see. Okay, so the conclusion here obviously is that how we socialize college music students into the music profession around substance use is really pretty important. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention is that because of the developmental transitions experienced by young adults as they enter college, it also provides us an important window of opportunity, you might say, for intervening on their future ways of relating to alcohol and drug use. So this is a good time to be trying to educate them about this. Okay, given the brief time available, the fact that alcohol abuse remains the most prevalent and best researched substance-related problem in the country, my conversation today will focus chiefly on the use and abuse of alcohol by college students. Hopefully this is also going to illuminate the problem of drug use as well, as many of the principles apply from alcohol to drugs, and drugs tend to be less well researched than alcohol. In comment to the presentation yesterday about amphetamine, I agree amphetamine has definitely been actually a long-standing problem. But if you just look at the wreckage around drug use, alcohol remains by far more significant than amphetamine use, even though for any individual family, when their kid gets hooked on meth, it's not a pretty picture and can be really, you know, heartbreaking. Okay, so where information is available, I'm going to try to apply this to college music students. But as I was saying, and from the written materials, there's a lot we just don't know in terms of the kind of numbers on that. Okay, so characteristics of college drinking. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is that the final report of this task force from NIAAA basically stated that the frequency of heavy alcohol use on college campuses is high, and that the pattern and level of use have changed very little over the last 20 years. So that's kind of the frame. Okay. So findings from key national surveys show that approximately 4 out of 5 college students drink, and that about half of them engage in heavy episodic consumption, or again, what we call high risk or binge drinking. So binge drinking here, and I know many people in the audience with this kind of a slide would be going, how am I doing with this? But binge drinking basically has been defined as 5 drinks or more in a row for men and 4 in a row for females. I wanted to put the juxtaposition here with what NIAAA is saying is recommended non-problematic use, which I know most of the people who come into my office at Kaiser Permanente in the addictions program, when they see, you know, 2 drinks for guys and 1 for women, it pretty much gets their attention. So hopefully this doesn't apply to anyone here, of course. Okay. Okay, so negative consequences of high-risk drinking among 18 to 24-year-olds. Now, in the written materials, I've actually put the numbers in with all of these different problems, and they're pretty high. Death, injury, assault, sexual abuse, unsafe sex, high percentage of kids saying they don't know if they consented to sex because they were loaded, academic problems, health problems, suicide attempts, drunk driving, vandalism, property damage, police involvement. A lot of bad things happen, and again, this is not just because people are addicted, this is just because they're using high-risk, practicing high-risk behaviors. Okay, so this really highlights the need to address the substance use across the spectrum, not just for addicts. Okay, so thinking about factors affecting college drinking, and I'm really being brief here, but the task force, which we know, reports that multiple developmental, individual, social, and environmental factors affect students' level of drinking. Things, for example, which I wrote in the written materials, and I'm not going to talk so much about here, that even participation in the Greek system, like fraternities and sororities, notoriously higher rates of drinking, and even higher if people are living in the dorms, like fraternity houses or sororities. So a very important environmental factor. Okay, so here's some risk factors we want college students to know about becoming addicted. If they have family history of alcoholism, one parent is alcoholic, for example, the person is 34% more likely to become an alcoholic. And again, most of these haven't been well studied about how does this apply to drug addiction, but I think for our purposes, we can assume it's kind of a similar process. If two biological parents of someone are alcoholic, the person is 400% more likely to develop alcoholism. So family history is a big one. Second one is starting to drink or use before the age of 14, probably due to the susceptibility of the still developing brain to toxic effects. There's stats that are in my paper that if kids start drinking and using, say at age 10, it's just like 500, I don't remember what exactly it is, but it's huge about the probability of later addiction. You know, people often like to say, gee, I have an addictive personality. Frankly, there's no good evidence for something called an addictive personality, but what we do have good evidence for is that if a person has a personality characterized by high sensation-seeking, impulsiveness, and disinhibition, these are the kids that don't seem to have normal breakage, you know, kind of putting the brakes on with risk. They just keep going through it and going into it. So that is definitely a risk factor for becoming addicted. If someone has pre-existing mental illness, you know, severe anxiety, depression, eating disorders, especially obviously if they're not treated, that's another high risk factor for developing an addiction. And high levels of environmental stress, which often comes along with growing up in an alcoholic family or a chaotic sort of family. So these are sort of the things that we would want college students to be aware of and look at their own personal histories about being at risk for developing an addiction. Okay, so really briefly, the defining feature of substance abuse is continued use despite negative consequences. For most people who are social drinkers, if they end up getting alcohol poisoning once or something, they stop drinking. People who go into substance abuse out of use to abuse, they just keep going despite negative consequences. And as I always like to tell my clients, you know, negative consequences may be real big obvious things like getting a DUI where, you know, by the time most people have gotten a DUI, they have had the opportunity and put themselves at risk of maybe getting a DUI many times. It's rare that someone just the first time out gets a DUI. So it can be, those negative consequences can be loud, obvious things, or they may be just much more subtle, like feeling kind of depressed. Alcohol is a depressant. It may be that the relationships aren't working that well all the time, and alcohol abuse might be part of that, that they're not attributing the effects of the negative consequences to the use, but after people stop drinking, they figure out that, gee, that was contributing to that. What we know at this point is about 31% of college students meet criteria for alcohol abuse, say in the preceding year, based on their own self-report. Okay. Okay. Talking about substance dependence, or what we would say alcoholism or drug addiction, this we would talk about as continued use with loss of control and negative consequences of use. So again, there's loss of control. Someone says they're going to drink this much, they end up drinking more over a long period of time. And about 6% of college students meet criteria for alcohol dependence in the prior year by self-report. So that's, again, a lot of kids can abuse alcohol and not go on to keep drinking at that level, but it still puts them at risk. Yeah, I lost the slide. Yeah. Yep. Let me back up here. Like I said, I didn't get a rehearsal on this. Okay. So overall, the contribution of heredity to drug addiction has been estimated as anywhere from 10% to 60%. So there's a lot of individual variation. What's important for kids to know and for you all to know is that not all alcoholics or addicts have family history of addiction. The way it works is that the higher the inherited susceptibility to addiction, the less environmental stress or drug use is required to cross that line from being substance abusing, or say substance using, to abusing, to being addicted. And some people basically drink or use their way because of dosage into getting addicted over time, even without family history. Okay. Okay, so talking more about career factors here, and again, this is so abbreviated, but a student's substance use or abuse may be affected by both active and passive social influences related to their career as a musician. Come on. Okay. Active social influences, depending on the musician's subculture and the type of venues involved, active influence would include being offered drinks or drugs, say, by club owners or fans when working regularly in bars or nightclubs or when touring. Classic example is the beer company sponsoring a tour, which is, we would talk about being an active influence on encouraging drinking, both for the musicians involved as well as for the fans. Passive social influences would include, again, perceived social norms of professional musician use and observed social modeling of musician use, again, drinking or using. Okay, and here's where one of John Hippel's studies from 2000 found that about 35% of the college music students he surveyed, and these were the same sample, I think, that had an actually lower rate of binge drinking, their perception was that about 35% of them perceived professional musicians using alcohol more than other professionals. So again, it just starts framing this idea of sort of passive influences on college music students. Krzyzewski et al. Surveyed self-selected musicians on the World Wide Web. I don't imagine anyone at this conference has gotten out of here without hearing about Chris's big study on the web, But they found that about 30% of those self-selected musicians perceived that there was a widespread drug use among musicians. This was especially true for the younger male non-classical musicians. They were about twice as likely as to perceive drug use in professional musicians. So point there is that the role of active and passive social influences on college music students, alcohol and drug use, we need to continue to study that and pay attention to those in the recommendations. Okay, so even though we're going to talk about some recommendations at the end of the whole panel, I'm going to put out a few here now that we would say to students. First one is, don't drink or drug while your brain is still developing, which in the old days they thought that was younger. Now it looks like it's about 20 or 21. And, that might sound just like the just say no recommendation, but I think it is important for college students to know this part about their brain's vulnerability, especially if we're talking about binge drinking. So the next recommendation, obviously, is if you do choose to drink before your brain has stopped developing, follow the safe drinking recommendations. No more than 2 drinks for men, 1 drink for females. Okay. Don't binge. Very, very bad for your brain. This is where we want them to have that information, especially when they're going to be in these counteracting influences like fraternity and sorority houses, where the kegers are set up and binging is sort of part of the whole deal. We also would recommend that students learn about their personal risk for addiction. Seek help if you're feeling chronically anxious or depressed rather than self-medicating with alcohol or drugs. Learn to manage the anxiety inherent in creative work without relying on substances. This is kind of a trap that many musicians fall into. And I think all the resources for anxiety management that we're talking about today, this is all part of helping musicians and college music students knowing what else to do other than self-medicating. We also recommend that they learn the signs of substance abuse and dependence and seek help if they see their use heading in that direction. And this is where we actually have some recommendations for faculty and colleges at the end, and we're probably not going to have time to get to all that today, but it's in your packet. Okay. Okay. The idea of avoiding social situations when you can, sometimes musicians just can't. There we're talking about if your music work takes you into obviously risky situations, what I would recommend is to have a college student set specific goals about what they're going to drink or use prior, if they're using or drinking, before going into the job and trying to elicit some support with a friend, a safe person, a bandmate or a friend, so they know kind of what they're planning going into that environment. And the advice is if you find yourself regularly drinking or using more than what you said you were going to do, then see that as a bad sign and get some help with that. Okay, just really briefly, and again, it's in your packet, the NIAAA study did put in some very specific recommendations to colleges about substance use and abuse. So our task force is just saying, read those, and we're going to, if we have time, talk about them later. But, there's some good strategies that NIAAA, with extensive research, has found to be effective. And obviously, the point here is that it's going to be a stepwise developmental process involving individual students, the student body as a whole, including teachers and administrators, and the surrounding community, including parents and alumni. This is going to have to really, everyone's going to have to be involved in this. Okay, so thank you all for your attention on this. And last but certainly not least, I want to introduce you now to Drs. Lisa Willis and Carrie Barnett, who will be talking to you about career issues. Dr. Willis is the Director and Director of Training at the University Counseling Center, University of Rochester in Rochester, New York, and works with the Eastman School of Music. And Dr. Barnett is a postdoctoral fellow working with Dr. Willis at the University Counseling Center in Eastman. So take it away.
Part of my job is I see Eastman students very regularly with clinical services. And one thing that regularly comes up in sessions is about career issues. And even if the presenting problem doesn't have to do with careers at all, it could be about relationships or depression, but it seems like almost every client coming in that's a musician somehow starts talking about career-related issues and how it's affecting them. And a quote that I think that does a really good job of describing what it's like to be a musician is on the screen. It says, being a musician is a wonderful and brutal life with incredible rewards and big disappointments. And the rewards, they're things that bring people into the music field initially. They're doing what you love for a career, enjoyment, the flow experience, being engaged in your work, working in a career that you've been training for your whole life, fame, ego satisfaction. I mean, they're things that anybody would enjoy and really want in a field. But for a musician working in the field they love, it's especially important. However, the disappointments are also very real, and sometimes music students are not aware of them at all or have limited awareness of them, but they're still very real and cause a lot of problems. And these include injuries, financial strain, competition, ego strain or ego injury, lack of stability. And sometimes the disappointments can outweigh the rewards and can be very problematic then. It's important to realize that it's impossible to guarantee a successful music career, even when a musician has great talent and exhibits a lot of effort and has good training. And the data has really supported this, and sometimes the data looks pretty depressing. The UNT data shows that 46% of their music majors graduate with a degree in music. And that means the rest end up leaving the music field, don't even finish their degree. And this is either because they come to terms with the fact that they might be highly talented, but they're just not going to be able to make it in the music field. They might not be good enough. And this can be a huge blow to their self-esteem, especially if they spent their whole life working on this. Other music students realize that the music field just does not give them the stability that they're looking for and that they want in their life, and decide they're going to go someplace else, and they'll just continue music as a hobby instead of a vocation. Music students who do end up graduating, this is based on Eastman data, only 18% of bachelor students and 28% of master students work full-time as musicians after graduation. And only 20% of bachelor students and 33% of master students work part-time as musicians after graduation. And even though the data shows that musicians who have either an undergraduate degree or graduate degree tend to earn more money in long run, they still have to hold multiple jobs, including several non-music related jobs, in order to make a livable income. So because of the poor job market, many students keep going on to get more education, hoping that that will help them likely get a job. And it's also something that's very familiar to them. I mean, they've been in school their whole life, they've been training. Why go out into the job market and have to face some of these really depressing realities and just keep going? But it's important to remember that the majority of music students who graduate do not find full-time work in the music field, and they have to work outside. And so even though they've spent a lot of their time studying music, they're not going to just be using that. There are also a lot of obstacles that musicians face, and this is something that music students sometimes are just not aware of enough, and it really does affect them when they go out after graduation, and sometimes it can be a real shock. But a lot of times around graduation time is when some of these realities start to hit musicians, and that's when they come to us, really in a panic. And music students need help throughout their training to realize that these are going to be things that they're going to face, and learn how to start preparing for them and dealing with them now before they're out into the job market. One of the obstacles is the lack of money, the need for minimum wage jobs or jobs that kind of support their music, low satisfaction jobs to supplement income. What the UNT Musician Health Surveys found that classical and non-classical musicians derive about 25% of their income from performing music. So that means 75% come from doing other things. And a lot of times those other things are not things that they enjoy. There's also very much a lack of stability of work schedules, locations, colleagues. I mean, there's constant touring, are you going to get gigs? Do you have enough gigs? Who are you going to be working with? That can be changing a lot. Even people in orchestras, there's rotating conductors. It's very demanding and tiring, and the work hours can be long, irregular, and that really puts a lot of stress on people. There's also a great deal of injuries and physical demands. And this can be a very stressful thing. I mean, an example is of an undergraduate clarinetist who has TMJ that was affecting his ability to do a senior recital. And some of the questions that he really was having to deal with involved, will his condition improve? Will he be able to perform his recital next year? Will TMJ continue to affect his performance in the future? Will it prevent him from making it? Should he give up his pursuit of being a professional musician? And this causes a lot of stress, and this is something that musicians tend to have to face throughout their career, and there might have to be a time they can't continue. There's also, because of having a difficult time finding jobs where you can support yourself, a lot of musicians tend to compromise their artistry and creativity for bread and butter jobs, and really sacrificing what they love just so that they can pay their bills. And a quote that really describes how this was a quote from a professional musician, was that most dull, routine, unfulfilling jobs are bad for people. For creative, skilled people, they can be like a cancer. Most bread and butter gigs consist of worthless music, and as usual, it is the most creative musicians who suffer most from doing them. And this is something that music students don't realize that they might have to face, being in an orchestra for a musical where they play the same piece over and over and over again every single night. Another obstacle is the competition of finding jobs. And first of all, it's such important for musicians to be in competitions and doing auditions, and those can be so stressful as it is. And it can be a very brutal experience, especially when there's very little evaluative feedback given to performers after these competitions or auditions. And what leads the musicians just wondering, well, what happened? What did I do wrong? Why didn't they like me? There's also such few spots in orchestras. There's going from being somebody that was a big fish in a small pond to all of a sudden being a very small fish in a big pond. It's like going from being the first chair in your high school or first chair in college to all of a sudden no one wants to hire you. There's so many other good people out there. And essentially, there are just too many good musicians competing for too few jobs. And this just causes a major stress and can really affect musicians' self-esteem. So Lisa's going to come now, and she's going to talk about some of the impact that the career stresses have on musicians.
Okay. Okay. The impact of career stresses on mental health of musicians is pretty much what we've been talking about all morning. So no surprises up here. Performance anxiety, self-esteem, self-doubt, which can lead to depression, self-criticism, perfectionism, feelings of instability, lack of control, we all want control, lack of steady relationships, and feelings of lack of autonomy from those that we're emotionally and financially dependent upon. And I have numerous stories about sacrifices that students are struggling with trying to decide to make or not, based upon whether or not their parents would have to continue to support them for some short period of time. So that's the last PowerPoint. What I want to do is talk a little bit about some recommendations for faculty and for schools. As Susan said, we're going to give some student recommendations. I think we'll have time for those still. Very fast at that. So I'm going to also be fast at talking a little bit about some recommendations for the schools. And also, if anyone's interested in talking about the College Counseling Center or Eastman or some of the specific things we've done with the satellite office there, that's something that we can talk about later. But we have put some specific services in place for the Eastman students and do have an on-site satellite location there. And I would be happy to talk to students or to other folks about that, what we do for students there. So first I want to say that really, rather than training artists, we should be thinking about training professional musicians to be successful. And that means more than training folks at their particular performance crafts. It's my belief that talent and luck are not enough to make it in the music business, that it takes knowledge about marketing and networking and, you know, the business end stuff of the music career. So some things that might be useful, which I'll go through very quickly, are to encourage students to learn more than music history, music theory, and performance, that's really important, that I think we can find ways to teach liberal arts and other courses that might give them a broad base of knowledge if they were to go into other things, so that they're not maybe only doing minimum wage jobs, but maybe it gives them a sense of sometimes even a dual career, and that we could find ways of teaching these things that would actually engage performers so that they would believe that learning these subjects would be also learning to be a better performer. Also supporting students who are interested in music ed or in leadership arts as well. Creating as part of a curriculum leadership arts and career development skills. I think, as Carrie was saying, one of the things that we see particularly in the counseling center, or I may get calls from students about, is that they're thinking about these things in their senior year, and it's way, way too late. It's way too late at that point. And I think if there were one thing I were to say, it's early. It's early intervention. It's thinking about prevention of some of these things, and it's sort of informing them about the realities that may or may not happen. And I think there's creative ways of doing that without bursting their bubbles. I think it's important then that schools provide faculty with training in the importance of how to help their students obtain positions in music. So the faculty have to be consistently and realistically talking about career issues. They need to use their studios as places to help students learn about group dynamics, problem solving, conflict resolution, all the things that later on impact the success of a band. How many bands have we heard about breaking up because people can't get along? Perhaps bringing in master class teachers that can do a multiple of things. They can sometimes do mock auditions. They can also talk about the successes and failures in their own career. I think the important thing is to recognize that having a career in music means facing disappointments and failures. And I won't go into this more specific recommendations in terms of time, but they are in your book. So thank you for your patience, and thank you, Susan, from the whole entire group for your coordinating things. That's really been a huge effort. So I hope I'll get a chance to talk to y'all later. Ooh.
Well, our worst fears that we've run out of time and we didn't get to everything kind of have come true, but hopefully we'll all continue to have our lives, even if that happens. So, in your packets, we've put out recommendations for students, as well as faculty, as well as colleges, because I think the main point I would like to just underscore here is that this is really going to have to be a systems effort, not just throwing information at kids. And I guess Chris wants us to wrap up. Well, where is he? Do we have time for any recommendation? Okay, about 10 minutes, okay. So I want to just say very briefly, in the recommendations, and you heard many of them embedded in the talks, we have recommendations kind of in each area, but I want to just read about 6 of them that are kind of general across the board. And I'm hoping maybe in the consensus building, we can continue to answer questions or discuss all the stuff with you guys. Okay, so some general recommendations that apply to all of the listed areas. This is where students would be encouraged to, 1, think about your whole being, body and soul. This is from Louise. As the most important instrument you must cultivate and care for in order to express your individual music. So again, the idea of being a whole person, not just, musical skills. On the mental health side, we're saying learn about your family and genetic history pertaining to mental health. Do you have a first-degree relative who has had significant anxiety, depression, substance abuse, or other notable mental health problems or disorders? And if you don't know, if the student doesn't know, who in the family might know? What was the family culture about expressing feelings openly and seeking help? All of those things are really important for a student to start thinking about. We recommend that students tune into their body and mind. Again, it's about learning about their internal world, including symptoms, but thoughts and feelings, all of it. Kind of figuring out what works for them and what doesn't about their mental health. We ask students to identify the people in their emotional support network. Who do you talk to trust? Who do you trust to talk with openly about your feelings and concerns, and then to start learning how to utilize that kind of support. We suggest students take their mental health seriously and ask for help so that they can deal with problems before they crescendo. It's not a question of mind over matter, rather it is your mind that matters. That's from Julie Nagel. We recommend that if personal concerns are substantial and ongoing, if a student's regular coping strategies are not working and they start feeling overwhelmed, to reach out for professional help, to learn about the resources available to them at schools, in the music departments, and in the community, to check stuff out. And last, we'd say rather than focusing on external success, money, or fame, we recommend students find success in the privilege and gift they have for being able to make music. So I think I'm going to stop talking, and we have time for some questions. Okay. And please, to anyone on the panel here.
Catherine Ananda Owen, St. Olaf College. Just two items, one related to performance anxiety and one related to depression, that I've not seen covered in the papers, haven't heard talked about this morning, and don't see any reference to in the recommendations that I'd like to mention now, as opposed to waiting for consensus building, in the possibility that other people may have similar concerns. Related to performance anxiety, the one thing that I don't see mentioned, and I'm aware that this may hark back to a harsher age in pedagogy, is the impact of inadequate preparation on the severity of performance anxiety. There have been some people in the studio area, I'm not one of them, but I'm aware of their work, Burton Kaplan at the Manhattan School of Music, for example, who talks about the rational response that, coming from Minnesota, if you walk out in January or February on a 10-mile hike without a coat, anxiety is perhaps a rational response in that circumstance, and theft of a coat might be another rational response at that point when you're 5 miles in and you're freezing. When a student is not adequately musically prepared, which at the undergraduate level can happen for a variety of reasons, but principal among them, problems with inadequate oral skills development, and I'm speaking oral, A-U-R-A-L, which we see frequently, and also technical development. These are things that can have a significant impact, anecdotally speaking, on performance anxiety. I don't see that mentioned, and that concerns me in terms of recommendations that this body might come up with for addressing that area or that concern. Related to depression, I didn't see any, possible music performance-related side effects of some of the medications, SSRIs in particular, that are used to treat depression. Again, my experience as a studio teacher is anecdotal. It's not based in medical science, but my suspicion is that music students are underreporting certain side effects that are related principally to their ability to imagine sound, as well as ability to memorize and process music. The people who they tend to go to who are prescribing these medications, if they haven't dealt with musicians, a student says, I don't hear the voices anymore, and the doctor says, well, that's a good thing. But if you're a composer, maybe it's a problem. And we see a number of students, unfortunately, we see too many students who are dealing with clinical depression. But among those, we see a number who come to their studio teachers or their composition instructors and say, I can't compose. And there's just not enough information about the impact of these drugs on neurological function. They may be treating the depression very successfully, and I would agree that the primary importance is, for a student who has a death wish at that point, that we're addressing that, because who cares what happens to their composition skills if they don't last the year. But because their identity is so wrapped up in their ability to function as musicians, it seems to me that at least information needs to be pursued, and possibly the awareness of this disseminated when we're addressing this topic. Thank you.
Thanks for the questions. I think you make good points. I'm going to just talk briefly about the performance anxiety. I know Eric had a comment, and others might, and then refer the medication question to Dr. White. I think for myself that, have you prepared is kind of the first question I usually ask anybody who comes in with performance anxiety. And so I think for myself, that's always built into it, because it's kind of the first things first. Eric, you wanted to make a comment about that?
It's a great point about rehearsing and preparing. The only comment I want to make is students need to know that there is anxiety present that prevents them from rehearsing and preparing. So if they're not doing the natural rehearsing and preparing, they need techniques for dealing with the anxiety, sort of day in and day out, moment in and moment out, and not just with respect to some particular performance. If that experience of anxiety could get reduced day in and day out, then their ability and their willingness to rehearse and prepare would be higher.
Yeah, I think the side effect issue is very important, and I didn't specifically address the performance disruptive aspects of side effects, but I did try to make it clear that being treated for depression has to be a collaborative effort between the patient and the doctor. Some doctors don't do that very well, but they should. And anytime a student finds that anything happens, he or she needs to report that to the physician, because it could very well be a side effect. And there are many side effects that can be debilitating, and it's one of the things that makes it very hard to find the right medication. There are lots of different medications. It's simply an empirical process of taking one after another to find what works for you. What works for one person is not likely to work for someone else. But anytime someone experiences side effects that impede their ability to make music, they need to talk with the doctor about it. If the doctor doesn't listen, find another doctor.
Exactly. I think we have to teach our kids to be aggressive consumers. And lots of times that's the other adults in the kid's life are the ones that can encourage the kid to do exactly what you were talking about, which is talk to the doc as opposed to just stopping.
And, you know, I think this kind of points out, obviously, we're a little biased on our panel, and you probably are too, about thinking that it's helpful to have professionals who are sensitized to the concerns of music students as well as musicians, to think about something like what would the impact of the side effects be on the performance. So.
It's like Baskins and Robbins, take a number.
Hi, my name is Juan Arenas. I just finished my teaching fellowship at the University of North Texas, and I wanted to make a response to the previous teaching fellowship comment made by Dr. Hipple. Whenever I teach my lessons, or whenever I taught my lessons, just finished, or I'm in the middle of doing my music and medicine related field as well, and during my lessons, I made it an assignment for my students to go once a semester to talk to Dr. Hipple as part of their curriculum. And I don't think I would have done that had I not taken those music and medicine classes. And I don't think the students would actually go had I not actually assigned them, made it an assignment for them to go and do that, because there's just that general stress of going to the doctor, so to speak. And they don't have, I don't think, as freshmen and sophomores, they don't have enough courage to realize that and go do it unless we assign it to them. And so my recommendation would be to actually make an assignment about once a semester for them to go and do that. And I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Kind of a checkup.
The problem we would have with that at our counseling center is, I think it's a good idea, and I'd sure like to come to your studio class. That's a way to kill many birds with just one stone. The problem with most counseling centers is we're just overloaded, and when we get kids just coming in and on kind of an assignment basis, they're often actually low priority in terms of presenting pathology. So I think if we could work out some sort of group kind of thing to talk to your kids, that would be maybe better from an efficiency use of time. But again, it's encouragement from the people who count to seek service, whether it's from a counseling center or for whatever, and that's really good. Thumbs up.
I'm Kathy Hammond from Morehead State. I have a question about kind of your proposal to require students to go for a counseling checkup. How would you police that? How would you get around the patient-doctor confidentiality? You know, do you just take their word for it that they went? Yeah, we just talk about that. Okay. but I think you might run into some problems there if you required all of your studio to do it. But I think it's a better idea to do a studio consultation
Yeah.
in mass, and then they can have the option of going one-on-one with you if they need to.
Yeah,
Yeah, it destigmatizes it too, which would be good.
yeah.
Any questions? Well, thanks very much for your attention, and hopefully we'll get to keep talking about all this tomorrow.
Thank you.